Hello and good afternoon if you're in Europe, the Middle East or Africa, and good morning to all of you on the other side of the Atlantic. Welcome to this webinar on risk disclosure and climate change adaptation, which is brought to you jointly by UNEP FI here in Geneva and the Global Center on Adaptation in the Netherlands. We had almost 50 participants registered for this webinar, so I'm just going to perhaps give it another 2 or 3 minutes so that we have, let's say, a quorum of participants, because I know that there will still be quite a few joining in the next 2 or 3 minutes. So I'll come back to you at around 2 or 3 minutes past the hour. Hello again, this is Paul Smith from UNEP FI. It's now 3 minutes past the hour, so I think it's a good time to go ahead, particularly as we've got quite a packed schedule on this panel to discuss climate risk, disclosure, and climate change adaptation. This is a webinar jointly hosted by UNEP FI, as I said, and the Global Center on Adaptation, based in the Netherlands. We've got a star-studded lineup for you today, and as I said, a packed schedule. So we'll go quickly on just a couple of housekeeping issues as we go along. And if you have questions, it would be greatly appreciated if you could ask any questions as you go along that you have on your mind, and either type them into the question box that should be on your dashboard, or to raise a hand, and I will look out for raised hands as we go along. Depending on the type of question and who is speaking at the time, we will either answer in the middle of the webinar or towards the end. Hopefully we'll have 10 to 15 minutes towards the end. But in order to have those 10 to 15 minutes, I should probably move on, because as I said, it's a pretty packed schedule. So this is the rough agenda. First of all, as I said, this is a joint webinar, so we would like to introduce briefly the Global Center on Adaptation, which will be introduced by Barney Dickson, who is on the line. Then there will be a brief introduction to UNEP FI's work on resilience by our climate lead, Remco Fischer. We will then have a review of what we are proposing as a commitment towards climate physical climate risk disclosure in the form of the Climate Resilience Risks and Opportunities Coalition. And then I will hand over to one of the leading financial institutions who has joined us in this commitment, and that is Rabobank, and Bouke de Vries will be presenting on their behalf about how they are implementing risk approaches and why they believe that the risk approach is the most appropriate in terms of trying to address the physical impacts of climate change in the financial sector. And then finally, we have another very distinguished guest, Irene Heemskerk from the Network for Greening the Financial System, on secondment from the Dutch Central Bank, and she will give a brief overview of the role of the NGFS in adaptation and in scaling up climate risk disclosure. And then hopefully at the end, if we keep to our schedule, there will be room for questions. So right now, I'd like to move immediately on to Barney Dickson, who will give a brief overview of our partners at the Global Center on Adaptation. Barney, over to you. Hello, Barney, can you hear us? Because there's no sound coming from your side. So you could unmute.
Is that
there
better?
We go. I think that's perfect.
You can hear me now? Okay, good.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Paul. Welcome on behalf of the Global Center on Adaptation to all the participants on the call. Global Center is very happy to be now collaborating directly with UNEP FI on driving forward the Climate-RROC initiative, the coalition which is working on risks and opportunities relating to physical climate risk. A brief Global Center on Adaptation, a newly established institution, the first major public event we were involved in organizing was indeed on disclosure of physical climate risk, a conference we co-organized with European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London in May last year. The Global Center is also the managing partner of the Global Commission on Adaptation, and we're looking to place this initiative, this coalition, within the Global Commission on Adaptation's action track on finance, on adaptation finance. So what I want to do briefly now is just introduce you, for those who are not maybe very familiar with the Global Commission on Adaptation, give an introduction to you on that. So the Global Commission seeks to raise the political profile at the national and global level of adaptation and the importance of adaptation, to make the case for investing in adaptation, and to catalyze solutions to address the adaptation challenges. That's the aim of the Commission. It was established, launched in October last year. It has basically a 2-year lifespan. If we can go to the next slide, please. And it will be sunsetting, ending its life at the end of next year, at the end of 2020. It has 3 co-chairs, Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgieva, formerly of the World Bank, now head of the IMF, and another 30-odd commissioners who are on this list, on this slide and the next slide. I think you will receive these slides, all this information, so I'm not going to go through that list of commissioners. Just that, there is sort of geographical, political, institutional diversity within our total of 33 commissioners. Whose commission is it? It's not actually a UN commission as such, although we work very closely with the United Nations in general. It is the commission which has been called for at head of state or head of government level by our now 23 convening countries and you can see those that list of convening countries of the Global Commission on the slide. A very quick look at the our sort of timetable, a schedule of events. As we were launched in 2018. In the last few months, we launched our flagship report in September, just before the Climate Action Summit. We were in New York, and we were then participated in that summit. And at the summit, or actually the day after the summit, we launched our Commission's Year of Action, which is essentially a year which is lasting 15 months to the end of 2020. And in that period, we will be, as I already indicated, launching a number of action tracks, including the one on finance, but 7 other ones, which I will tell you about in a moment. And there on that slide, you see some of the other events that the Commission will be participating in over the course of the next, 12 months, really, including most sort of key milestone for us is the Climate Adaptation Summit in Amsterdam in October next year. So our report, if we go to the next slide, as I mentioned, launched on 10th of September, essentially sets out the case for investment in adaptation, stresses the importance of increasing awareness of climate risk both in the public and private sectors, and the value and usefulness of disclosure as a tool to raise awareness of climate risk and the necessity to address it. If we can just go to the final slide, which is about the Global Commission's action tracks. Each of these action tracks sets a number of ambitious but achievable goals. And under the finance action track, as I said, one of the key elements is going to be this Climate-RROC initiative, where we're setting an ambitious goal for catalyzing increased disclosure of physical climate risk within finance institutions, with the aim of then having sort of consequential or knock-on effects throughout the wider economy. So thank you very much. I'll stop there. Happy to answer questions, probably perhaps towards the end of the call. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Barney. That was a very good condensed introduction to the GCA. I want to hand over to our climate lead here at UNEP FI, Remco Fischer.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Paul, Barney. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining this webinar. I just wanted to, reflect a bit on where this new coalition on physical risk and resilience at UNEP FI, where that's coming from, what the history and context for that is for you to understand. In essence, there is 2 sides of the history. One side is something that most of you in the UNEP FI membership probably are aware of, which is our various finance industry pilots to on the TCFD. The TCFD framework that was launched a number of years ago. As you know, we've been working with 80 financial institutions to develop methodologies to carry out scenario-based risk and opportunity assessments for financial institutions, and we've done that for banks, and we've done it with insurance companies and investors, and 2 such pilots are ongoing. And what's interesting about the TCFD is, of course, that it emphasizes very much not only the risks and opportunities from economic decarbonization and from the transition to the low carbon economy, but also the risks and opportunities from physical climate change. So from the hydrological, the meteorological impacts of climate change. But that work that we've been carrying out on TCFD over the last 3 years, including on physical risks and opportunities, really looked at the problem from the perspective of each individual financial institution. how would an individual financial institution start carrying out these analysis, these assessments? What does the modeling look like? What do the disclosures look like? And we've made a certain amount of progress on the technicalities of that. But then in parallel, we also entered into a collaboration with the Global Commission on Adaptation and the Global Center on Adaptation that Barney has introduced at the beginning of this year to look not only at these matters from the perspective of individual financial institutions, but more systemically at the level, from the perspective of the finance sector and the financial system, trying to ask the question, what needs to occur? Well, actually, the two questions: what needs to occur for the finance system, the finance sector, to become appropriately resilient to what we can expect from physical climate change over the next years and decades? And secondly, how can we get the finance sector to become more enabling and more proactive in delivering finance toward the adaptation investments that are required? All of the recommendations there got captured in this report that you can see here. It's on the UNEP FI website. And interestingly, if we can go to the next slide, these are the recommendations in the report. And actually, we basically just spotted that a lot of what needs doing and needs to be done both at the level of the individual financial institution and what needs doing at the level of the finance system boils down to TCFD type assessments on physical climate risk and physical climate opportunity to be mainstreamed in the finance sector. There is a big overlap there. And as a result of that, we asked ourselves as UNEP FI, well, what does this mean going forward? And well, it means us creating a platform of leading financial institutions committed to this notion of climate risk disclosures and climate opportunity disclosures on physical climate change, and to drive that in this 2020 year of action. We now have this group. It's a very young group of different kinds of financial institutions who have come together, and whose purpose it is to, again, mainstream this notion of climate risk assessments and climate opportunity assessments responding to the TCFD in 2020. And this is I think what we will now touch on from this slide onwards. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Remco. I'm here, Paul Smith. I'm the adaptation lead, as it were, within this team. And we launched this coalition of financial institutions to disclose on physical risk by 2021 in September at the UN Climate Action Summit in New York. And really the idea behind this is that we want to see how physical climate-related risk disclosure can have an impact not only on the financial sector in terms of financial stability and in greater transparency and better decision-making by financial institutions, but also how it can support the real economy in adapting. So here we have the vision and the mission of the initiative. These are really headline items that we just want to come back to as we're working through this initiative and trying to build a coalition of leading financial institutions on this. So really the vision is that, this disclosure of risk should support the real economy in adapting. And part of the work of the coalition will be to make those linkages. And the mission is really what we're doing. So it's enabling and headlining leading financial institutions to disclose risks, and within that assessment of risks, to also highlight the opportunities that are available from adapting to climate change, because there will be opportunities, and of course it's important to stress and to highlight those opportunities so that we all understand within the financial sector that this is not just a negative issue. There can also be some opportunities from adaptation. So if I just go to the next slide. So the headline commitment is really this disclosure of climate-related physical risk by 2021, by the end of 2021, in a sort of TCFD style approach. And why we wanted to do this, we've been leading TCFD pilot programs with all the subsectors of the industry, with underwriters, with investors, with banks, as Remco said. But within these pilot programs, there wasn't a sort of public announcement that all these financial institutions would disclose. So what we wanted to do with this initiative was to put, on the one hand, a public commitment out there, and secondly, to highlight the importance of risk assessment in addressing the physical impacts of climate change. On the transition side, we're working with financial institutions more towards Paris alignment. But on the adaptation side, we believe that risk is the better approach. So there are a series of actions that will also help to scale up this commitment. It will be engaging with financial institutions, and this webinar is also a part of that outreach and engagement. We also want to, while this commitment is not going to go deeply into the technical and methodological developments that the pilots are going into, we do want to try and promote access for financial institutions to those methodologies and tools without partnering with them and piloting those tools. And thirdly, we want to engage with supervisors, regulators, central banks on building support for public policies, which will encourage this at the sector level, which is why we have the NGFS with us today, Irene representing them. So why a risk-based approach in terms of adaptation? First of all, it's practical. The TCFD provides a framework, provides guidelines for assessing risk, for managing those risks, and for embedding and mainstreaming risk assessment and risk management into the framework of financial institutions. And it has grown massively since its launch in July 2017. For example, PRI has introduced voluntary disclosure and reporting by its members. And we have also piloted this approach with our members, as we said, and some case studies from those institutions have been published. It's also important from the point of view of signaling, because it's no good just waiting for consensus across the financial sector. It's important that action is taken now. We're already seeing the physical impacts of climate change. This is an urgent issue. And so therefore, we can't just sit on our hands and wait for everyone to agree. We need leading financial institutions out there pioneering this work, saying, yes, we want to disclose. And then that will encourage other actors within the financial sector to follow. And with pioneers, there will come greater development and greater accuracy in those assessments and disclosures. Then the real question is, how can risk disclosure accelerate financial flows to adaptation? This is the real question that we have been thinking about within the coalition. And I think it's important to translate what we're doing here from the finance sector and building resilience within the finance sector to the real economy. And how might it do this? Really, this is to some extent hypothesizing, and I don't think risk disclosure has been in place for long enough to draw solid conclusions, but we think that transparency can highlight high and low risk investments, and that an emphasis on risk and risk pricing will encourage companies in the real economy to make the necessary investments to reduce and mitigate those risks in partnership with financial institutions, and that this will also provide the necessary signals through a financial medium, not only to the private sector, but also to public sector institutions to address some of the more high risk and more vulnerable areas that are most at risk from the physical impacts of climate change. So how will this commitment develop over the next couple of years? First of all, we want to engage with financial institutions, as I said, through webinars such as this one, but also through events, bilateral calls with you, And we're also embedded within the Global Commission on Adaptation's Action Track on Finance, as Barney said. These are some of the events that we will be leading into next year, including COP26, where we want to really launch this commitment with a critical mass of financial institutions committing to disclosure. We will also start to provide learning opportunities to promote methodologies and technical tools and data. And the centerpiece of this will be hopefully an online data and information hub, which we will start to develop early next year. And we'll collate all the UNEP FI information in this area, but hopefully we'll spread to collate information on disclosures by financial institutions throughout the finance sector and collate tools and methodologies from other providers. And then finally, we will build support, as I said, with various public sector institutions that are leading on policy and regulation and so on. So now I'd like to hand over to one of our panelists, Bouke, representing Rabobank. They're one of the leading financial institutions who have joined this coalition. And Bouke will explain to you why they've joined this coalition and the importance of risk measurement and disclosure for them in terms of adaptation. Over to you, Bouke.
Yes, thank you very much. So I lead our climate work in Rabobank and advise our chairman on this topic of climate change. I would like to talk with you about some of the issues that we are addressing today. And not before saying that we support this initiative of RROC to make sure that we have a public-private cooperation. And I think it's important that we make this work. So if you can click to the next slide, please. Well, first about the urgency, you talked about this during the seminar a little bit already. But Rabobank identifies water stress already as an urgent adaptation risk. We see this in our activities in Africa. We see this in New Zealand and Australia. So our clients are already confronted with some of those impacts. We also see the risk for our real estate portfolio, clearly our own country, but this has been witnessed sadly in more areas around the world. So we want to be able to estimate that risk. And once we've done that, we will disclose our findings. I also summarized a little bit the impacts of droughts and wildfires happening more frequently and with higher impacts. And I added the transition risk, which is basically the response by regulators faced with those new challenges. And the legislation on environment will become more strict, which will have consequences for our clients and for our bank. Then I mentioned the Dutch Climate Agreement. This is a public-private cooperation, you could say. We just concluded this arrangement with our government. And we will halve the emissions in our economy in 10 years' time. And of course, we try to move towards a carbon neutral economy in 2050. This is a big task. So for each sector in the economy, we have discussed how the sector can make the necessary steps to become more resilient and to bring down emissions. And our bank is supporting those transitions and is willing to provide finance for the transitions. Could you please click? Yeah, so then how about the topic of today, the disclosure of those risks? First of all, I would like to mention that obviously there's already an existing obligation. Material risks need to be reported. And we also see a merit of bringing more information to the market because it increases the level of awareness of stakeholders, and it also provides a perspective to our clients, which they can use to take action. An example of that, so for example, in agriculture, we have looked at very concrete possibilities for our farmers to reduce methane emissions, or to look at different crops to grow, to become more water resistant for water stress. That kind of examples, they can be speeded up and scaled up considerably if there's more information in the market. And we try to contribute to that. Finally, it's of course also a way to show our approach to all of this. So if you can click on the next one. So what is really needed to do this and to make it concrete? First of all, what I find tremendously helping is to get one shared company vision. So Rabobank is a big organization. We work in 40 countries around the world. We have over 35,000 employees. So first of all, we need to get a clear vision where we want to head together. And that's the role of the climate program to do that. A second big challenge, which is really needed, is to get more granular sustainability data. So for that reason, we work with, for example, statistics offices, try to combine their data with data of our organization to see patterns, and also to see who is performing already well and who is lagging behind. And we will go to our clients to ask them more data. I already mentioned the multidisciplinary approach. I think we need to have a combination of risk, of business, of reporting to make this work. And communication and training are key factors. So we are training, for example, 2,000 of our employees how to advise the private clients on sustainable mortgages. First, they need to be empowered, that they feel confident to have these discussions. Supportive legislation, clearly, and for that reason it's good that we have an outreach to governments. It's better to have standards and to have a common understanding, common definitions, and of course it also helps if there are good climate laws. The final point, and we can talk more if you have questions, is we are working on improving our client photos. So for a banker, financial risk is already a basic business, but we need to improve on how do we score our clients on sustainability risk and on climate risks. The final one, please. The next steps. So our bank is going to continue with work on stress testing, to improve our data, and also to get to more granular conclusions. We are engaging with our clients, and we should do much more in the next years. For that reason, I already mentioned that first we train our own people, and then we intend to have much more discussions and engagements with our clients. And this all comes together, I would say, in the disclosures, the TCFD disclosure, for example. So in the next annual report, we will give a summary of what we have been doing and what we will do in the coming years. We will also publish a footprint of our portfolio. First, this footprint will be for the Netherlands, then it will be expanded to the full balance sheet of our bank. We also work together with other stakeholders, pension funds, insurers, and banks, to devise a standard for that, platform on carbon accounting financial standards. So that kind of information you will find in our annual report. We will say a few words about our strategy, how we are going to implement the Dutch climate agreement. And then the years after that, you will see much more granular and detailed disclosures. We also intend to publish a climate report in the second half of next year, allowing us to bring more information to the market. Then we continue with the UNEP FI pilot. We were part of the first pilot, but we also joined the second one. And the initiative that we have today on how to increase disclosures and cooperation in the field of resilience. Combined with the dialogue with legislators and supervisors. For example, that's also my role to have discussions with the European Commission and with the European Parliament on the green taxonomy, for example, that they're making. And the discussions also with the central bank, of which we will have Irene later in our webinar. If we do all of this together, we will have an enhanced risk framework in the end, which is truly responsive to climate change. And I look very much forward to work with all of you and to share our knowledge on this, to get to that point that a climate risk is considered in the same way and is integrated in the same way as the financial risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bouke. Just to highlight at this point, before I turn to Irene, that we're doing much better for timing than we were this morning. So please come in with your questions. We would have a question for Barney from Navin Beris, but we'll come to that at the end. So Barney, just check the questions so you're prepared at the end when we will pose that question to you. But now I will turn to Irene, who represents the Network for Greening the Financial System, and she is seconded from the Dutch National Bank. So over to you, Irene. You have 8 to 10 minutes, I guess.
Thanks so much, Paul, for inviting me to be on this panel. Really appreciate it. I think what the COP taking place these days, I think this webinar is very timely. And if I just realize that currently the pace we're on is 3.2 degrees global warming, if we look at the current climate commitments of the Paris Agreement. So I think to really focus on the physical risk side and the impact it can have, it's really I really appreciate the work you're taking up on this. Today I'm here to talk a bit with you about the work of the Network for Greening the Financial System. So I give a bit of background on that, and then I'll move on to the work we do. So if you could turn on to the next slide. Yeah, great. So a bit background about the Network Greening the Financial System. It was initiated nearly exactly 2 years ago, on the 12th of December 2017, by 8 central banks around the world. So Mexico was there, the Singapore Monetary Authority, the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, and then so the Bank of England, Banque de France, the Bundesbank, BaFin, the Swedish supervisor, and the Dutch Central Bank. These get together. Okay, we need to have the finance track as well involved in the Paris Climate Agreement, and we see the need that there is a need for central banks and supervisors to act on climate change and the impact it will have on the financial sector. The chair of this network is Frank Elderson. He's in the board of the Dutch Central Bank, so that's why I'm also closely involved with this work. Since these 2 years, we've grown massively. Today, we're 51 members. I think next week we're expected to be with 53, and they come from all over the globe, from Asia, from Europe, from Africa, from the Americas, the Pacific. And we also, for example, have the European Central Bank on board as a member. And then we have a big group of observers with the IMF, the World Bank, and the EBRD, for example, but also the standard setting bodies of like the BCBS, the IAIS, and IOSCO. And I think this is a good thing to mark, that this group, the NGFS, is really a club of the willing. They work together to learn from each other, share best practices, and issue recommendations on what is needed to have a better risk identification and next to scale up green finance. So what we do, the recommendations we issue are voluntary. So that means that we hope it will feed into standard setting bodies like the BCBS and IIS and IOSCO at some point. So we're really happy to have them on board as observers. So at the end, they can take over the work whenever they are ready to do this. But we hope with the NGFS to accelerate the work central banks and supervisors can do. to become a member, you really have to be committed. You have to have a board member signing a letter. I want to be a part of your network, and this is what I want to contribute. So it's good to work with this Club of the Willing and see it really helps to make progress. I think you experience it as well with UNEP FI and the Global Center for Adaptation. If you work with people who want to move ahead, you can go. And that's exactly what we need in this time. So this is a bit background of the NGFS. What we do, what I said, we issue recommendations. On the next slide, you'll find the recommendations of our report we published last April. That was the first comprehensive report based on all the practices we've seen within the NGFS membership. Okay, what are like the core topics to focus on for the coming years? And well, you can read the report. That I think the slides will be sent along, and there's a link to this report. But the most important, I think, if we talk about physical risk, is the first recommendation on integrating climate-related risks into financial stability monitoring and micro supervision. And the number 3 as well, bridging the data gaps, because I think we still need a lot of data and maybe different kind of data to better assess the impact of climate risk. And when we really think about this issues as well, transition risk, but today we will focus on physical risk with you. The other recommendation that is really relevant today is the recommendation 5. So the first ones are aimed at central banks and supervisors. Okay, what can we do to accelerate this? The other 2, 5 and 6 are addressed to policymakers, because what is disclosure is not in all remits of central banks and supervisors to do this, but we do see the need of a better and robust and consistent disclosure worldwide, because then you can really manage the risk. And that's not only the disclosure of financial institutions, but from the whole economy. And the the sixth one, the sixth recommendation is on taxonomy. Okay, what is green and what is brown, right? We need to have more a definition on what kind of economic activities support a greener economy. And the European Commission has a big project on this, of course. Bouke already mentioned it. I know China is working on it, or already has one. And I think worldwide we need more consistency in that. And I think that's really what the NGFS tries to bring to the table. More consistency in the work that supervisors and central banks do, and learn from each other in this. The work we have planned for the next year, what is relevant for the physical risk side. One of them is the scenario analysis. We're currently developing. The Bank of England is in the lead there, together with all the NGFS members that want to contribute, making scenarios. Okay, what is if we have a hot world, if we have a late transition, if we have a smooth transition, what could the impact be on the financial stability? So they're really working out on these scenarios. And this is for central banks and to apply in their forecasting models. But I think this could also have a kind of a well, what is it? Influence on the rest of the world. Okay, if central banks are using this, maybe it is a good model we could see. The other 2 publications we are planning next year is one is on that's a big companion led by Ma Jun from the People's Bank of China. That's a publication on what kind of environmental risk assessments are currently taking place within the financial sector. That's going to be a long document, about, what is it, 200 pages, I think today they're predicting it. But on top of that, there will be an NGFS kind of appreciation. Okay, this is what's happening, and a summary. This is what's happening in within financial institutions on environmental risk assessment. The third one, that's the work I'm leading, and Greg, I don't know if he's on the phone now, from the EBRD. He's working with me on this. is preparing a guide for supervisors. Okay, and that means really how do you integrate climate-related risks into supervision, because we see that there is effect in market risk, credit risk, operational risk, for example. But what do you do as supervisor to really start integrated from scratch? How do you organize yourself? How do you assess the risk? How do you plan to set, like, for example, supervisory expectations? What the Bank of England has done, the Deutsche BaFin just released, the Dutch Central Bank also just issued a set of good practices for the banking sector and the insurance sector on how do you as a supervisor what do you expect from the financial sector to act on this? So I really see here the touching ground with the work you're doing, because I think with the NGFS membership growing, you will see more and more supervisors around the world coming to financial institutions, asking them, okay, how do you manage climate risk? How do you manage the physical side of it? So this initiative can really contribute to that. So this is what I want to say about the NGFS. To conclude, I think the biggest challenge is that currently the risks just are not properly priced in the assets, right? That's a big challenge. And to make it, to make more disclosure on the physical side could really contribute to that. And I really appreciate that the financial sector themselves are taking action on this. And yeah, I really hope it will help to come to reach a 1.5 world at some point, because if we have a hotter world, it doesn't look so appealing to me. So thanks so much for your attention, and I want to give the floor to back to Paul.
Thank you very much, Irene. That was an excellent overview of the work of the NGFS. And I think it was very important to highlight that we are at COP25 now. And as you said, even if we meet the Paris, the Paris Agreement, we're looking still at a 3.2 degrees world, which means some considerable impacts from climate change. So even if these commitments are met, we have to be prepared as a world to face those impacts, and the financial sector has to be able to price those impacts into the investments that it makes. So we just want to move on to questions now. We have around 10 to 12 minutes. We have one question from, I did say it was from Naveen Paris, but in fact from Kuntal Singh, I believe from RMS. And this is perhaps more of there could be a finance spin on this question, but it covers a number of issues perhaps, and is for Barney from the Global Center on Adaptation. And the question is what the center is doing in terms of increasing resilience for smallholder farmers. So perhaps I could ask that to you, and I would also like to turn that question to Bouke in terms of what Bouke was talking about, water stress in Australia and New Zealand, and how that impacts on investments in agriculture and forestry over there. But first, Barney, do you have a response to that question? Hi, Barney. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Good. Yes. Well, very quickly, as you may remember from the slide I put up, was possibly was too quick, but one of the Global Commission's action tracks is on food security in agriculture in the face of addressing that challenge in the face of a changing climate. That sets the specific concrete goal of making 300 million smallholder farmers more climate resilient by 2030. So the question about smallholder farmers and resilience, what are we doing about it? Well, this is one of our 8 core areas of action over the next 10 years. I'll leave Bouke to say more about the sort of finance angle of that, but obviously there would be, if smallholder farmers are not resilient to climate change, then that is going to create risks for anybody whose investments in agriculture are dependent on those, ultimately on smallholder producers. But I'll hand over to Bouke. Thank you.
Yes, so I would like to add a couple of things. I think the information position of smallholders is important. So we will try to help them to provide good overviews of what risks they are confronted with. And our Food and Agri Research Unit has 100 people across the globe working on this. Clearly, the challenges in Africa are different to New Zealand and to Australia or to California. So there's some specific approach to the Americas or to Africa for really smallholders, whereas our farmers that we bank in Australia, most of them are large farmers. I think there's also an element on farmers need to produce more with a smaller footprint. So to be able to meet the challenge of 9 billion people on this planet needing more food, and at the same time the way we produce it is completely not sustainable. So that can be helped by increasing production, but not in the same way as we have done in the past. So we need to look much more at circular concepts. Increasing production, but staying in a smaller footprint. And also we have the challenges of biodiversity loss due to various production methods. So what we want to do in our approach to finance is we cannot tackle all of these problems as a bank, but we can integrate those elements in the conditions that we provide for our loans. I mentioned an example. In our own country, but we also intend to do this in other countries. We try to incentivize our farmers to respect biodiversity, and we give them a rate cut if they can convince us, but also the World Nature Fund, who is working together with us on this, if they can convince us that they pay more attention to biodiversity at their lands. And the final example would be to start developing land passports. So how the farmer treats his lands is going to be of importance. It will be a condition for our loans to the farmer. So those are some examples that we have. Not all of them only for smallholders, also for larger farmers. But specifically for smallholders, of course, the one and the other example is more relevant.
Okay, Bouke, thank you very much for your intervention there. I think that was very important to highlight the importance of technology in terms of passports, and also the fact that biodiversity is a major issue. We can't operate in a bubble here in terms of climate adaptation. There are other impacts, and biodiversity is one of them. And biodiversity COP next year is a very key one. Which will bring together a baseline assessment of what is happening and what needs to be done to change the massive impact on biodiversity that much of our economy is having over the next 5 to 10 years. I would just like to ask the participants if they have any further questions. I don't see any right now, but if anyone wants to raise a hand, I can unmute you. And you can speak, or alternatively just type your question. We probably have time for one more question. So I have a question just of my own right now, perhaps for Bouke, and perhaps Irene maybe has a response as well. But what have been the main difficulties that you have faced in developing credible risk assessment and disclosure? Bouke?
Yeah, so one of the key difficulties is the availability of data at the right level of granularity. The second challenge is the mismatch between the global IPCC scenarios and the kind of things that you can model in your own stress test. So the work of DNB is interesting because there are some efforts trying to make this match, but still there's a difficulty there. So I think those are already two big challenges. The third one would be, I think, that we actually would like to integrate this really in the modeling, but those models, they are not built for that. So we need to find new ways to try to integrate those risks in our risk approaches. And for the moment, we will use scenario analysis and stress testing, but ultimately we would like to get it integrated in our risk assessments. And for that, we need to learn more on data and on impacts and so on.
Yeah, what I would like to add to that is maybe what my experience is that it's important to have the right metrics on how do you measure the risks. For transition risk, you can look, for example, to the CO2 exposure of the assets of a financial institution. But for physical risk, it's really what Bouke already said. It comes down which data do you need, because you cannot really rely on the historical data because it's changing, right? The climate. So what kind of new data do you need? The interesting thing that was also mentioned is it's not only the weather events, but also, for example, the impact on the biodiversity loss and how does that affect the agriculture sector or other sectors in the world, the food sector for sure. So yeah, we're facing quite a challenge, I have to say, but that's why it's even more important to pick it up and work together.
And maybe if you allow me to add a little bit on that, I think Europe is doing a very good thing in asking companies to disclose more data. So not only the financial industry, but all companies need to disclose more climate-related and ESG-related data. I refer to the non-financial risk directive. And the second thing, I also make a plea to governments to try to help that, is to provide access to public databases. And an example I can give here is that we try to ask them to refine the way they disclose their emission data, for example, at a more granular level, so we can match those data to our client portfolio. And once you are able to do that, you can see differences in performance, and we can also credibly move towards Paris, because you can only take credible action if you know where a sector is heading, where your client is, and if he's making the next step or not. And that is really one of our key areas that we want to challenge all of our clients to make the next step and to improve on their climate footprint.
Thank you very much, Bouke and Irene. I think really the data gap has been highlighted as a major problem. The data seems to be there, but what type of data is it? Is it available? And is it useful for financial risk analysis? There is one last question from the audience, but I'm conscious of the fact that we're coming up to the hour now. Two things before we go. So I'm sorry, Quintal, you maybe will have to address your question directly to the panelists, because there will be an email going out after this webinar, which will include the email addresses of all the panelists today, as well as a link to a survey, which I'd really appreciate all the attendees to complete. It's a very short survey, so will not take long. And secondly, there is a handout, a PDF copy of slides from today, so that you can go back over those, and there should be links to documents and websites in that PDF document. So sorry, we don't have time for the last question, but please address that to Barney, to Bouke as necessary. It's about crop insurance, and I'm sure there are some good answers available. But as we're now on the hour, I think it's a good time to wrap up. Thank you to Bouke, to Irene, to Barney for participating in this webinar. I think it was an excellent overview. Thank you to all the participants for joining us today, and have a good evening or a good day, wherever you may be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.